Good morning. My name is Mary Gardner-Briggs, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Maximizing Impact, Prioritizing Investments for Students' Long-Term Success. We are really pleased to be able to speak with you today about a topic that we think is important from a governance perspective. And when we think about at CSBA, the roles of board members and some of the key components of your work, we think about things like hiring and evaluating a superintendent, setting the mission and vision for your LEA, adopting policies and approving LCAPs, engaging with the community. But there are two really important ones today that we want to focus on, and they are critical at this moment in time. The first is adopting and monitoring local budgets. And the second is monitoring district performance and student outcomes. All of these are in support of student learning and well-being. And while those last two, budgets and monitoring performance and student outcomes, are critical, they're very challenging. First, because budgeting is often done with a high degree of uncertainty. And when you think about the budget development process, for instance, we think that about key milestones and how we're making decisions when we don't even have a state budget. So in January, the governor proposes a budget for the coming year, but by March 15th, LEAs have to notify their classified and certificated staff about whether or not they anticipate potential layoffs. And again, that's without having a budget in place. In May, there's a revised budget. And by June 30th, you have to have your budget adopted, regardless of where the state has been along the way. That's not even accounting for federal uncertainty, both in terms of budgets and now some questions that we're having from the field about whether some budget items might be pulled back by the administration after budgets are passed by Congress. That can create a lot of concern and really uncertainty about how to make the best decisions on behalf of your LEA. And from a more local perspective, there can be uncertainty about how effectively funds are supporting student outcomes. That's that second component we were talking about, student outcomes. We see this in conversations in the last couple of years come up with things like the end of ESSER relief funding. So as those dollars were ending, we heard from a lot of our members about how there had been programs that they rolled out during that time that they wanted to continue. And as that funding was leaving, they were trying to figure out, are there ways that we can fund these in different manner so that we can continue those programs? But you're still trying to make decisions about what to keep and maybe what to let go, particularly with the impact on students in mind. You also might see this with other state or federal categoricals. Today's webinar is really in response to that feedback from the field about how challenging handling budgets during an uncertain period can be, and attempts to offer insights into the current fiscal context for California's public schools, but really thinking about the governance perspective and how governance teams can provide and prioritize their investments for maximum impacts on student outcomes. You may hear some terms that are kind of fancy, like academic return on investment or student outcomes focused governance. But the bottom line for both is thinking about how you, as a governance team, can approach your role in the school budget process with an impact on student outcomes in mind. And so with that in mind, today we're going to cover several topics. And on the next slide, you'll see our agenda. After some introductions and housekeeping, we will have some presentations from WestEd about trends that are impacting California education finance, how to prioritize investments to maximize impact. We're also going to hear from Fresno Unified School District's Board President, Trustee Valerie Davis, on a process they've been doing called student outcomes focused governance. And then we will end with a group discussion. On the housekeeping slide that you'll see next, just a few little things for you as an audience so that this process is as smooth as possible. In the bottom of your ribbon below the speaker on your screen, you are going to see a little button that says Q&A. The chat feature has been turned off, but when you want to submit questions for our panelists, you can submit them in the Q&A space. Your questions will be answered either in the Q&A feature in writing or live by our presenters. And at the end of this, all attendees and registrants will receive a link to this video recording as well as resources in a follow-up email after the webinar, probably within about a day. So with that said, I would like to introduce you to our panel today. I'm Mary Gardner-Briggs, your moderator, Senior Director of Research and Education Policy Development here at CSBA. We are joined today with two colleagues from WestEd, Dr. Kelsey Krausen, the Director of Education Finance and Systems Planning, and her colleague, Patrick McClellan, Education Finance Research Associate at WestEd. And again, we will be getting the governance team perspective from Trustee and Board President Valerie Florentino Davis. So I'm going to hand this over now for our first portion of the discussion, and that will be Patrick McClellan discussing some trends impacting education finance in California.
Thanks, Mary. So I appreciate the introduction. I'm just going to tee off our conversation by touching on a few different data analyses. The first one here on the next slide is going to have to do with enrollment forecasts. Then we're going to break down some revenue, as well as some broader trends separately from the financials. So what this first slide here is showing is the enrollment forecasts over the next 10 years and then over the next 19 years on the left and the right, respectively. The headline number here and the reason that this is relevant to revenue is that overall enrollment is forecasted to decline by 16% between now and the school year 2044-45. So obviously that's going to have a direct impact on ADA and on school district revenue. What I think is notable here is that there's actually some counties that are forecasted to increase in enrollment, but overall, the mostly urban or suburban counties in the Bay Area and as well as Southern California are forecasted to experience pretty significant enrollment declines. And this is mostly a reflection of declining birth rates and some migration patterns, but regardless, this is going to have a clear impact to LEA's bottom lines as it relates to revenue. So this slide here kind of unpacks more of a near-term forecast, looking at the percent change in a few key metrics between school year 25-26 to 27-28. These data come from the multi-year projections that were approved in June. So this is kind of the most recent budget data, budget forecast data that is available. So the top bar here is ADA. So we're seeing out of all the 125 LEAs that were in our sample, the median percent change in ADA was a slight decline over these next 3 school years, a decline of 1%. Total revenue is the typical LEA is expecting to be relatively flat, just a 3% gain between 25-26 and 27-28. That relative stability in total revenue is being driven by a pretty, not large, but again, a steady or flat increase in LCFF revenue. And again, this is the median. So, and to that point too, on these are median statistics, the federal revenue was really something that we wanted to call out. So the median change in federal revenue between this year and 27-28 is 0%, which is to say there was a very wide range of projections looking at these data. So these Districts projected anywhere between a 64% decline in federal revenue to a 13% increase in federal revenue over these next 3 years. So overall, what we're seeing is flat ADA, flat revenue, and a lot of uncertainty in terms of federal revenue. What this slide does here is it's again looking at the same data source, unpacking a few more data points, and looking at these data points by district type. So generally, we're seeing similar trends across all district types. High schools look to be, or I should say, unified school districts, um, kind of have a slightly different trend there, the gray bar there, but overall, a pretty consistent message, flat or declining ADA, flat or slightly increasing revenue, and basically no change in expenditures over the next 3 years. But again, just to highlight this feeling of uncertainty or of a slight slowdown in, in expenditures and new programs, these fund balance bars tell us that there's a significant amount of deficit spending that districts are projecting over the next several years. It's most pronounced among high school LEAs, least pronounced among unified LEAs, but really the thing that jumps out of the page here is that there's going to be a significant amount of deficit spending, as evidenced by kind of dipping into those reserves. And then finally, just kind of looking forward a little bit more into the next couple of years, these data show the number of school districts over time that have either a negative or qualified certification according to the interim financial reports. A negative certification indicates that the LEA will not meet its fiscal obligations in the current or the next fiscal year, and a qualified certification indicates that the district may not meet its fiscal obligations in the current year or the next 2 years. The main takeaway here is that districts are in relatively good health by this fiscal health by this metric, but that the district fiscal health tends to follow larger economic trends. So given the uncertainty in overall revenues and given the uncertainty in macroeconomic conditions, this is sort of just another indication that there's a lot of uncertainty and district leaders are feeling a little bit of concern for, or at least not really knowing what's to come in the next several years. So the next slide will just wrap up what we've seen so far. What we're seeing is that even though student needs are, just as high or higher than they were before the pandemic, um, revenue is flat or declining. LEAs are moderately healthy compared to previous years, but from the MYPs, we saw that revenues and expenditures are going to be flat through 2027-28, as well as deficit spending. And finally, the federal funding cuts and broader economic uncertainty are causing a lot of complication in district budgeting decisions. And we saw that in the multi-year projections as well, with, again, a really wide range. Out of all the data that we looked at, federal revenues had the widest range of projections. So we're seeing a lot of uncertainty, both anecdotally as well as in the data that are available to analyze here. So here we're going to have a few poll questions. The first one that's going to pop up has to do with revenue increases. So this is kind of a nod to the multi-year projection data. We were interested in kind of understanding from your perspective whether you expect revenue to increase, decline, or remain flat in your district over the next 3 years.
people can wrap up their responses, I think we will be able to share out results in a little bit.
All right. So we're seeing from, just really right off the bat, just my initial reaction here is that this is kind of what I've seen in the multi-year projections data. So we're seeing 4 of the 39 respondents saying an increase in district revenues, but just as many more thought revenue would decline. And 18 out of the 39 thought that revenue would remain flat. So we're seeing, and again, kind of translating this to the median, the way that this might show up is a 0% change, so a flat change in that trend. But I think the wide variety, the wide range of responses here really underscores that uncertainty that folks are feeling. And so this next poll is going to see, or this next poll question is going to have to do with the most concerning area in terms of budget projections. We've been hearing a lot about rising costs, whether it be with salaries and benefits or facilities costs, various categories that seem to be all increasing. We've heard about federal funding uncertainty. There's been, different programs have been, there's just a lot of uncertainty in terms of what's going to stick around over the next couple of years. And then this declining enrollment is another big one that we've heard, but we wanted to hear as well whether those were the only three. Maybe there's something else that's more pressing in your mind. Just take a few more seconds to wrap up your votes there, and then we can kind of walk through the answers to this second poll question. All right, so we're seeing again rising costs, almost just in terms of the frequency counts here, rising costs more concerning than flat revenues in terms of just the folks that were able to respond here, but. I think what's jumping out to me is rising costs at the same time as declining enrollment. I think again, just my initial reaction, that makes a lot of sense given that there's kind of some deficit spending going on. There's the same, number of staff or the same programs in order to keep those in place. In the presence of declining enrollment, the way to make that happen is to dip into the reserves if that's available. So really interesting responses and great engagement so far. I really appreciate your time and your votes here. And I'll pass it on to Mary, who is going to introduce Trustee Davis.
Yes, thank you, Patrick, for walking us through the current context. As Trustee Davis is turning on her microphone and camera, I just want to say how much I appreciate that background information to build into our later conversation on the academic return on investment and prioritizing things. But before we continue, I want to really bring this back to your role as governance team members. And so it's always, I think, important for CSBA that we highlight the voice of our members who are out in the field and who might have some thoughts about really what the appropriate role is for a board member in the budget process. So welcome, Trustee Davis. I'm very happy to have you here. Just wanted you to take a moment to stop and help, kind of frame this discussion by addressing how you would describe the role of the board member in relation to the district's budget.
Well, we started something we called student outcomes focused governance. And we believe that student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. And with our student outcomes focused governance, it emphasizes the board's role of less of a day-to-day management and more about ensuring budget decisions serve the district's student-centered mission. We have to ask ourselves, are we spending money positively that will affect the student outcomes? And are we monitoring it? Should we budget or allocate money for different areas, different, agreed upon results, and hold our leadership accountable for those outcomes, monitoring the success of what we've allocated and what we've agreed on.
I really appreciate that. And I want to point out that in our conversations leading up to this webinar, one thing that Trustee Davis was really mindful of is knowing, Fresno Unified is a really large district, and that we really wanted to approach this less about specific district actions and more about the mindset. And I think that you get at that mindset, whether it's a district with 350 students or 300,000 students, that thinking about, I think you've talked about staying in your lane and not that day-to-day management, but that budget is a powerful tool for you in terms of really driving home that emphasis on what the investments are doing for students. And I think that is a great way to kind of lead us into the next portion of our presentation today. So I'm going to hand this over to my WestEd colleague, Kelsey Krausen, who is going to talk with you about this prioritizing of budgets.
Great, thank you so much. So as Trustee Davis just described, school board members have a really critical role as fiscal stewards, as stewards of the budget. And this is, more important than ever in this time of uncertainty as we look at current and future funding. So we're going to talk a little bit about strategies for prioritizing investments and specifically ways of centering both student needs and student outcomes in those processes of prioritization. And this is based on WestEd's work with school districts providing technical assistance. And so hopefully some of this will resonate with you and things that you're already doing in your work and ways to build upon that work. Okay. So why is it important to take a systematic approach to prioritizing investments? We know that most schools and districts offer a really wide range of different programs and services for students beyond just the core curriculum. You're offering after-school programming, summer school, tutoring, SEL, ed tech, just to name a few. But many of those programs in school districts don't have clearly defined objectives and metrics for measuring whether or not they're having their intended impact on student outcomes. So it can be challenging for board members, for district leaders, to really identify which programs and services are having the greatest positive impact for students. Next slide. So we wanted to share some sort of high-level considerations for budget decisions. And we know that districts have really made incredible strides in using student data to understand needs in the system. So data infrastructures have been built, reporting on student data has become more frequent, and using those data to really understand where are their needs among students, among particular student groups, among students at different grade levels within the district, and then really targeting programs to meet those needs. So if we know that we have more students who are chronically absent in kindergarten, we can target programs to really do that additional outreach and engagement to students and their families in the kindergarten years. As an extension of that use of student data, what we're seeing in some districts is moving into really focusing on also looking at student outcomes. So using data not just to look at student need, but also looking at student outcomes to understand the effectiveness of programs. So that's sort of this next step that districts can take in really understanding where are those programs and services providing a real value add and benefit for students, for schools, for teachers. And then pairing that data with data on costs to understand for every dollar spent, what is the return on investment that we're seeing? And then, of course, considerations around the types of funding, the overall level of funding available. So pairing those sort of three data on funding, student outcomes, and student need together in thinking about how to prioritize and make decisions around the budget. Okay, so what does that look like in practice? This next slide shows a kind of range of options for understanding impact. We use the term impact loosely here, but on the far left, you see there are rigorous evaluations of programs that can tell you really the causal impact of a program on student outcomes. Those tend to be pretty high cost and large in scope. Generally, there's a need to engage external experts to support that. Then in the middle, we have the academic ROI, or return on investment, that Mary mentioned earlier, which is this effort to really systematically use data on student outcomes and pair that with data on cost to understand where you're really getting the most benefit out of programs, out of your investments, and where students are getting the most benefit. So this is a way to help you evaluate if you have numerous ed tech investments or numerous investments in K-3 literacy, which ones are actually making a difference for student learning and at what cost for the district. And then finally, looking at the far right end of the spectrum is just starting to look both, at the same time, but maybe in a less systematic way at student data and data on costs. To start to look at programs in a more holistic way as part of the budget process. But this may be a sort of less systematic approach. Okay, on the next slide, we provide just some ways that pairing that information on program effectiveness with program costs can help districts gain more information about resource use to inform decision-making and also to inform future data collection in the district. So first, by pairing program effectiveness data with data on cost, it helps the district understand what is the bundle of resources that are used for each program. So in this, we look at resources beyond just the funding, but also how much time does it take from your teachers, from your administrators, others, and other resources that are being contributed towards the program's success. And also allows you to see which programs just require the largest resource use in the district. When it comes to making decisions based on data on program effectiveness and program costs, it helps the district understand if you are in a position where you have to make trade-offs between programs, which ones are providing the greatest benefit for dollars spent? And are you getting more learning gains from one program compared to another? And then finally, as we mentioned before, it allows you to really look to see where are there programs where there isn't a really clearly defined objective and metrics attached to it so that you can start tracking information about whether or not those programs are having their intended impact. So where might there be new structures or processes for data collection and reviewing data as part of your budget processes in the future? So finally, just to sort of summarize here at a high level, I know that was a lot of information all at once and pretty quickly, but there are sort of three big components to thinking about looking at the the impact of programs as a way to prioritize investments. First, there's a process of really determining which programs to focus on. So we know time is the greatest resource in our systems. And so to do this type of investigation, rather than focusing on every program and service, every investment in the district, which are those programs and services that are really high priority to focus on? So that may be the programs that are aligned with the goals in your LCAP. Maybe it's looking at all of your early literacy programs, or all of the programs focused on reducing chronic absenteeism. Or it may be that you want to look at those programs, just the most expensive programs, or the programs that require the highest resources. So the first step really is just determining how to determine which programs to focus on, and then starting to inventory those programs. Where do you have those clear objectives aligned and metrics, and where do you see those gains being met, and starting to prioritize those programs based on the impact that you're seeing, pairing that impact data with your data on costs. And then finally, determining which of these programs do you maybe need to think about sustaining over time because they are having a really critical impact on improving student outcomes. Where are there programs that it's time to sunset them because they really are not meeting their intended objectives? And where are there maybe potential opportunities where a new program is merited, where you need to start something new in the district? All right, and with that, I will turn it back to you, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey. And I'm going to be speaking now with Valerie Davis, trustee from Fresno Unified School District, about Fresno's journey that they've been taking for several years. And Trustee Davis has been along for that journey, and really kind of talk about what this looks like in action, this idea of prioritizing the focus on student outcomes. And so I guess maybe let's start, Trustee Davis, with a really kind of straightforward question. Just could you tell us a little bit about Fresno Unified's journey to student outcomes-based governance from your experience as a board member?
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, last spring, we started a listening session, and the board members went out 2 by 2 to our community with parents, with students, with our community, nonprofits, our teachers, and we listened to feedback using the Thought Exchange survey platform. We listened to our community, to their hopes, their dreams, their desires, what we were doing right, what we were doing wrong. And we had reoccurring themes, and our community has very strong opinions of what we need to be doing and how we should be doing it. So we took that back and we formed 4 big goals, 4 basic goals, and put guardrails around there, what we would do and what we wouldn't do, and how we would hold our administrators accountable to it. So that has guided our work. And now the next phase we're in, we establish our rules, our goals, our guardrails, and now we're monitoring. We had our first phase of monitoring how far we had gotten on, say, the first goal or what we're looking at. So it has helped us truly focus our work and hold everyone in the system accountable.
So for Fresno Unified, what were the items that rose to the top for your 4 goals? What were some of the areas that they wanted to really prioritize?
Early literacy. What does that look like? Are we there with it? Are we spending, our resources on our very first students' early literacy? And if it works or it doesn't work, what are the interventions? What are the supports we have? Goal number 1, early literacy. Goal number 2, literacy interventions. Goal number 3 are Are our students college and career ready? Do they have options? Are they moving toward, their A through G requirements or receiving the certificates they need for employment? And life skills is our fourth goal. Are students more than just, what do they call that, marketable? But are they ready to face the complexities of being an adult and living in the world and contributing to our society? On our guardrails, our superintendent, she will always listen, and she will gauge everything she does by our community engagement. Is that truly what our community wants and expects? And are all of our students equitable access? Or all of our students have the same opportunities, regardless of what their life situation is, or what their parents have or don't have, or where they live? And the third guard role is effective staff. Is she hiring and promoting and evaluating the leadership? And, those that hold dear the credentials in our system to teach our students. And health and wellness. Are children being treated with us or have the opportunity to have health and wellness, social emotional learning? Are we considering the whole child and not merely an input of information, but where do the barriers or the complex situations that our children have to face, and are we really supporting everything that impacts them so they can learn? That's what we learn. That's what we're working.
I appreciate that very much. Can you talk a little bit about some of the shifts the board has made to more closely link its budget decisions to student outcomes?
Well, it involves studying and reading a lot of data and watching the trends and seeing, what's truly working, and making hard decisions of, things that haven't been working. If we had this resource in place and it didn't bear the fruit we needed, or it wasn't being applied with fidelity, we just have to look at all of that. So we're at the beginning stages of what we call monitoring the effectiveness, and understanding that even with our contract outcomes based, are we looking at the vendors and the people that come to us with contracts? Are they realizing that what we need for them to produce is what we need to buy and pay for is what they need to produce for us? So we might hold back a fraction, a percentage of the payment, and they will have to work with us to make sure that, their product is being, committed right, or everyone is doing, all of the books and all of the resources, that they are being worked on with fidelity. There's just a lot of intricate parts that we have to look at.
So, I guess thinking about this, I know that the student outcomes focused governance is one kind of more recent, deeper piece of work. You had been doing some of this work previously with a focus on academic return on investment, is my understanding. What benefits has Fresno experienced as a result, and maybe some of the challenges?
Benefits. I think everybody is really attuned with the expectation, the high impact, and the alignment. I think that everyone in the system, our teachers and our vendors, they understand that this has to be aligned to what our goals are. And low impact and misalignment will result in non-usage of that program, or reduced, or that that book or that program will be eliminated. So it serves as yet a very challenging. We have to ask ourselves, but that's no different than, you know, the way you handle your own personal finances or the objects and the things that you buy in your home or for your family. We just wouldn't buy something because it's the next shiny object, but how much will that program produce? What are the outcomes for our students?
I know that in some of our conversations, you really wanted to call out smaller school districts, you know, how relevant this would be to smaller school districts. And we haven't really gone into great depth about what kind of district level support you have in place at Fresno. It's fairly substantial, I think, in terms of, you know, supporting this work. But because you really wanted to kind of highlight some of the applicability to places that might not have that deep of a district office bench, I guess, you know, what are some ways that they might use strategies, even if they don't have necessarily the same level of staff as Fresno?
Well, I think because a district is smaller, it'd be easier for them to cut to the chase and find out exactly how it's working, you know, not just from, you know, region to region, but from classroom to student. And the dive would be even that much deeper. We have a team that meets every Friday, and they have to look at all the proposals and look at what the teachers are saying and study the data and find out if all of the things that we have in place are being utilized with fidelity. Are they really following, you know, the program, the recipe of it, or, you know, are they just cut to the secret sauce and finding out that, you know, there's other parts that have to go in to support it. But with the smaller district, I think you'd have more of the availability to reach down and find out truly what the students need before even the data tells you that. And because you don't have, you know, teams of people that go over, you know, hundreds of contracts and test things, pilot things throughout different regions of a huge school district, the intensity and the possibilities to monitor what truly works and where you can best spend your money is even that much more imperative.
Appreciate that. Going back to one of the key points from our presentation today, you know, how would you say Fresno Unified determines which programs or initiatives provide the best return on investment?
Well, that would be just opening that data and watching the trends and what we call interim guardrails. We monitor and double check and see what's happening, see how useful and productive, you know, something is, a strategy is from level to level, or even what's working in some classrooms, and you know, pulling out the best practices and sharing those with our teachers and with our staff, with our principals, and learning how to best evaluate what is really happening and how we can support what our students need.
So it sounds like when you're talking about the data that you're looking at to make decisions about what's really having bang for the buck, so to speak, you're also not just looking at quantitative data, but that you're getting feedback from teachers and you're getting feedback, you know, from people who are implementing it, which I think is a really important component, because you can buy a program off the shelf, but if it's not being implemented in a way that is working for the classroom educators, I think that's a big factor. I guess maybe the last question before we transition into a larger group discussion is thinking about your role as a board member. Part of that is communicating to the public, communicating to staff and the community itself. What communication strategies has Fresno Unified found most successful for sharing its rationale for budget decisions?
Well, because we are such a large district, this last week at our board meetings, we started, as I said, our first monitoring. And from our last SBAC testing and scoring, the superintendent broke it down in your red, your yellow, and your green type of, where our students were, where they had landed, say kindergarten and first grade. And, we were on target, how many of us were on target, and a list of how many schools, down to the classroom, down to the teacher, down to, and then how many of us, the largest group, of course, was how we just barely missed that stretch growth, that growth to our numbers. And it wasn't but maybe a percentage point off or something. And what could we have done, or how do we need to focus something, tighter? And then that red group looking district wide, because it doesn't concentrate just in one community or one area of school, one classroom of this side of town or that side of town, but what shows us what we truly need to focus on. So in that respect, it gives us the data that when we stop, like I said, student outcomes change when adult behaviors change. When we look at the whole district as a whole district and not 7 trustees and 7 regions, but what truly needs to happen throughout our entire, district, then we can focus our supports and see that, all the students are worthy and are seen and are, addressed, all the needs of all the students, regardless of where in the community. So the work is new and the work is a little daunting, but we shared that and getting deep and finding where we need to support our principals with their walkthroughs and their evaluations and where are the supports needed. That's the main. How can we get our administrators, our teachers, our staff better equipped to teach our students? Are they teaching the proper rigor? And is it consistent throughout the entire district and not just pockets of excellence?
I appreciate that very much. So I think at this stage, we're ready to move on to the group discussion. And I want to remind those of you that are watching online that we do have a section down at the bottom that has a space for questions for you to submit to our panel. And so please feel free to use that feature. As we kind of wait for a few questions to load, I have a few in my back pocket that I'm hoping that we could talk about as a panel. So I think one thing I'd like to start with is, Kelsey, you talked about the role of, thinking about some balance between student need and student outcomes. What are some ways that people might identify the places of greatest need for them to focus? What are some strategies you might recommend?
So I think in terms of, starting with existing district priorities is generally a really sound approach, because we want to be creating alignment in our efforts across districts and not starting new efforts that feel like they are separate from the current direction. Not that we can't make moves and determine new priorities, but focusing initially on, as Valerie was very clear about what Fresno's current goals are, looking at early literacy, looking at literacy intervention. So if the district is really focused on moving the needle on student outcomes in those areas, really starting with looking at the detail on student need in those areas, and then also where you're seeing students who are enrolled or participating in a particular intervention, where you're starting to see some initial gains in achievement, and not just in the state standardized tests, but looking at your interim iReady assessment. So that I think one of the things that stood out to me from Trustee Davis's remarks is just this idea of monitoring. So budget, the process of developing the budget and understanding the impact of investments is not a one-time thing. It's over the course of the year. What are the ways that we're looking at the data, looking at our investments, so that all of those decisions don't have to be made at one point in time?
That's really helpful. We have a question from the audience, and this is for Trustee Davis. Does Fresno utilize a budget advisory committee to help with financial decisions?
We have a community audit that shows us, what everything is going toward, or, what our staff is spending on, but I don't think we have a budget committee. We do have that every Friday group that looks at all the contracts and all the departments, and they might have to tell every department, you got to trim, 5%, 10% or something, but not per se a community group or a group dedicated to just that.
Great, I appreciate that. We have another question. It's, I think, partly also a response, based on experience, and they're thinking about this topic. And I think that it mirrors a lot of questions that we're hearing from members. And what part of what we've been really highlighting is the uncertainty. So just want to share this question/response. I was surprised to the low concern regarding federal cuts, given that the prior impoundment showed every district how much they might lose. What was the statewide average as a percent of district revenues? While the impoundment was reversed, aren't we now facing most of those same cuts in the next federal budget with even special ed potentially being cut substantially? Any thoughts, Kelsey, Patrick, about the concerns people are thinking about in terms of impoundment?
Yeah, I can kind of weigh in a little bit, and I want to hear from the other panelists as well if they have any thoughts. I can say I think this really reflects this concern about what the future holds in terms of, and I haven't actually reviewed the latest round of the federal budget, but I think a lot of these questions don't have clear answers in a way that maybe in previous years there was much more confidence that certain funding was going to stay there in the next several years. Um, I think kind of with a nod to this first section of the question, what was that, if this is a question, what was that statewide average as a percent of district revenues? In California, it's relatively small, anywhere between 3 and 5 or 6 or 7% of revenue comes from federal sources. But I think first of all, the districts that have a higher share of revenue coming from federal sources are going to be those really high need districts with many English learners, many unduplicated pupils. So even if it's a small percentage of the total budget, it might represent a set of really meaningful programs or staff. So all this to say, even if it is a small percentage, I think there's a lot of overall uncertainty and questions that don't have clear answers.
And I would just add, our team has started to analyze, some of the different title funds that have seemed particularly vulnerable to potential cuts. And what we see is when we look at the per pupil amount, on average, it's relatively small across districts. But then there's so much variation in impact. I think to Patrick's point, that some districts will be hit much harder, and the total dollars are much larger than when you just look at per pupil or on average. So I think that's really important to start looking at specific federal funding and doing some scenario planning around whether or not they may be fully funded, partially funded, or potentially not funded at all.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Susan Markarian, and it is, what is the process for making improvements once you have identified the weak areas? And does the board track progress and improvement in the identified problem area? I think, Trustee Davis, do you want to maybe tackle this one first, thinking about, when you've seen some data come back and you've said, okay, this is an early literacy issue, that's one of our main focal points. How do you move forward, and how are you as a board tracking that?
Thank you, Suzanne. Well, everybody knows that which gets measured gets results. So we haven't, like I said, this last week was the first time we tracked our, just the first thing that we did, just looking at the SBAC from the kindergarten and the first grade type of data. But there's a lot of conversations. There's a lot of conversations going on about evaluations. Our principals and our support staff and our SOSs, area superintendents, giving the support. And are we following the capsules? Are we evaluating people and holding them accountable for what they should know, what they should be learning, what they should be teaching? And we're just starting at it, but that would be, the grand scheme of things, the grand plan of it, to evaluate it and help them out or help them out. We have work plans. We have to even teach our people, take nothing for granted. And we looked at how many we had on work plans in the last 7 to 10 years, or how many were even evaluated in the last 7 to 10 years. And we had huge gaps in that area. So we're kind of starting at square one. And all of this is open to our community and, part of our transparency.
Great. I just have, I guess, I'm going to pull back to build on something that Susan was asking. Let's say a district, Kelsey or Patrick, identifies an issue related to 1 or 2 student groups and math outcomes, for example. What are some places that you would recommend LEAs think about finding resources to address that issue? So, I mean, a first thought would be maybe a county office of education, the local folks. But do you have other advice in terms of kind of throwing out the net for who might help address a particular area that has been identified by the data?
Yeah, it's a great question. Certainly county offices of education, there's the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, there's research organizations like WestEd, and other research and technical assistance organizations that have, done a lot of work to investigate different types of intervention for different student groups and their impact and ability to actually support improve student outcomes. So certainly the research, also using CSBA and your board colleagues who are, many of whom are really facing similar questions and challenges around improving student outcomes. We know chronic absenteeism is an issue statewide. Early literacy is the focus in many districts because we know the the association with longer term outcomes. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for resource sharing among districts as well, as we're starting to tackle some of these really persistent issues in student outcomes.
Thank you. Okay, this is a really important question when we're talking about, evaluating the impact of programs. So from Constance Schlafer, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. How long do you give an initiative to take hold? This is so crucial because I think we've all seen examples of things that are just starting to take root and people have moved on. But also, how long's too long to hold on? How do you avoid jumping from one initiative to another looking for immediate results?
Is that for me?
I think
Okay,
anyone who wants to kind of
Well,
dive in.
we did a study to see how many goals we had, and we had over 300 goals, district goals in Fresno Unified 2 years ago. So trimming that down, we're committed with the student outcomes focused governance to the next 5 years. In 5 years, we'll continue to poll our community and find out what's, at the top of their list and what they would like to see their students, our students and our community learning and graduating, and what what is it that we're doing well, or what we need to improve on. So 5 years, and we're going to hold our new superintendent and all the staff there accountable for the next 5 years.
Okay. Kelsey and Patrick, anything you'd kind of like to add?
I think it's such a good question. And I would say it varies when we do sort of large scale analyses in districts and we're inventorying programs. Generally, we want more than 1 year of data to look at to understand whether or not we're seeing movement in student outcomes. That said, I think this ongoing review of data and then peeling back the layers on what you were seeing. So sometimes you may identify that a program is not actually having its intended outcomes, and it may have more to do with the implementation than the actual intervention. So what the review of data allows for is not necessarily at that moment making a decision to end a program, but to have deeper conversations with those who are implementing to understand, are there other shifts that can be made in the interim that will make the program more successful?
I think that's huge because a lot of times when I've started as a teacher myself and have family who are all working in schools, and listening to different members and their experiences, it can be really tempting to say, we tried that already and it didn't work. But when you have those deeper conversations about what trying that looked like, a lot of times it can come down to how were the educators in the classrooms given the supports that they needed for rollout, for example. So I'm thinking of an example of a district that was looking at about discipline alternatives. And, there was one school that was working on rolling it out over 3 years, really prepping people for how to implement it, so that, when it was at full implementation, people really had the resources they needed, versus another school where they had, a Monday training and, people were implementing it by the following Monday. And that implication, I think, is really important. All right, moving on to a question for Trustee Davis. When you went out 2 by 2 to gather feedback from the community, how long did it take to get to the point where you felt you had enough feedback to move forward with?
We all started with a huge list And when we kept hearing the same things over and over, and we did this at the end of the year, so, we gave you ample opportunity, to show up or go online and, take the survey as it was. So when we gathered, kind of enough is enough, we had them on the weekends, we had them in the evenings, we had them in the daytimes, we had them at coffees, we had them in other people's offices, we had them in churches, we had playgrounds, we had them everywhere that we could go, and we went out, 2 by 2, and with the script that maintained the integrity of, and staff, to maintain the integrity of every single input and opportunity we had in front of our community.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take a question slightly out of order, but I think that this gets back to kind of thinking about evaluating a particular program. From Bruce Ross. I have struggled to get my district to find a way to evaluate the effectiveness of our ELOP, that's the Extended Learning Opportunities Program, and summer school programs at all. We've been told that it's difficult to get good data to compare alternatives. Any thoughts on getting started?
Well, I have kind of an opinion from the researcher's point of view, and I think maybe Trustee Davis might have some good thoughts on this as well on the practitioner side. But this is something our team struggles with as well. There's a lot of interest in evaluating ELOP and really any kind of innovative new program. And we run into this issue of you can't really find a great apples to apples comparison of um, this district ran ELOP and this district didn't. The differences in the student outcomes, well, maybe it's due to running ELOP, maybe it's due to differences in student need. And so I'm not sure exactly, Bruce, if that's kind of what the superintendent is getting at in terms of difficult to get good data. Um, a starting point that I might employ is just looking at comparable. So getting at comparing your district to a relatively similar district in terms of student demographics or of school size or district type if you're in a unified district, comparing your outcomes to a district that's also unified that maybe has similar student demographics. But it really is a big challenge. Something that we run into in the research world a lot, and there's not a great answer. But I think looking for as close to an apples to apples comparison might be where I would start. But I'm curious to hear what others think.
Well, we started really focusing in on our tutoring after school with our staff. If it's, what are they called? The after school program or the teaching fellows, just really hitting hard what we would like to see them teaching or reinforcing or supporting. But I think the data would be, things that you want to look at is the attendance. Is it, maintaining itself and the behavior? Are there less little squabbles and fights, or, is it kind of the discipline that's consistent in the classroom is also consistent after school, as well as the academic, tutoring, the support. So, are they coming? Are they faithful to, is it supporting all the attendance all day long? I get to go to after school program, and then, our after school program always has the opportunity to perform, be it holiday time or, the springtime, it might be something that they want to do, or you perform, or even, what do you call that? A staff versus kids baseball, kickball, volleyball, or, something that's fun. So I think there's lots of opportunity to informally, which supports, the whole student and the big picture of student outcomes.
I think something that you're saying, Valerie, that comes to mind for me, and Bruce's question is identifying like what you're hoping the goals are of the ELOP program in terms of either academic impacts or also, I think this was mentioned, attendance, if there are other metrics that you're really thinking about. So like honing in on what you're trying to evaluate and identify what metrics might be appropriate, I think is a key piece, because evaluating the program as a whole might feel, I think, a little overwhelming, because ELOP specifically or summer school specifically can have a range of different components that you might associate with different student outcomes. So that would be one thought. Kelsey, I think you had unmuted at some point
I was
to maybe add.
just going to make the same suggestion, is just as a starting point, defining the objectives and how you will know that the program is meeting those objectives. And I think, many districts are investing, having outside vendors come in to provide services. I know some California districts are starting to use what's called outcomes-based contracting, Fresno among them, which is one where when you're working with an outside vendor, actually building in student outcomes into your contract with them, so that some of the payment is contingent on outcomes. And so that, although there is a partnership between the district and the provider in meeting the expectations of the contract, and it moves away from all of the burden of evaluation falling on the district, which your superintendent may also, it present a challenge for the district to do on their own.
Appreciate that. We have another question from Greg Larson, and this is specific to counties. So Greg says, I understand that this is appropriately oriented toward local districts, but I am wondering if there are any lessons from Fresno or guidance from WestEd's work for county offices of ed, especially given the lack of public understanding of County Office of Education Services and even lower awarenesses of COE funding and budgeting.
I think it's such a good question, and I think the same ideas are really applicable at the county level, around, looking at the expected outcomes of county investments and the metrics that you're using to evaluate whether or not progress is being made. It seems like a really great opportunity to make more transparent the work of the county office in supporting students, and the ways in which the county is actually doing work to improve outcomes, and how you are incorporating those efforts into your budget decision-making processes. So I think from our perspective, that this presents a really great opportunity for county offices as well.
Great. And Greg, if we weren't able to get at your question, if you want to add in like a follow-up, happy to take a look at that. Maybe we could respond in writing to that piece. Just a call back to some of the questions about implications for federal funding and some of the uncertainty from Superintendent John Bowes. For a low unduplicated pupil UPP district, my district is 6% UPP. Federal funds are less than 0.5% of a $100 million budget. So while any and all funding is desperately needed, federal funding is not as high as a concern for a low UPP district like ours as compared to enrollment and rising costs. So just a maybe context for why maybe one was highlighted over another for one district in a particular context. So I do have a couple of other questions, if that's okay. And if Greg wants to add in a little bit more, but I just am kind of wondering, let's get back to basics for a moment. If there is a district or a county office where someone's on this call or they watch this recording later and they say, this is really interesting. I don't think our district has approached thinking about budgeting in this way. Where would we get started? How do we bring up this conversation? Can we just roll it back a little to like the what next for someone who's interested? Where should they have that conversation, superintendent, with their fellow board members? Any advice that you might offer?
I would say, look at your data. Who needs what, where, when? And let that, drive you. Where do you need to, not spend or manage? What's happening with your budget now? How are you managing the money that you do have? And where would you like to see it managed more or focused more?
And maybe even, what data you choose is, as Kelsey mentioned, aligned with whatever goals you currently have. I do think that's such a huge point as we're having conversations. I know almost every district where we have conversations, every county, there's initiative overload. We tend to have a sedimentary approach to layering on program after program, and that can often happen when there's turnover of staff who come in with great ideas that they want to try, but in terms of what it looks like for the people who are implementing, it can be a little much. So identifying some of those goals, like Fresno has identified 4, I believe. Is that correct, Valerie? 4 main goals. That actually can be used. Yeah, big difference. But I think that is a way of also trimming things that are not necessarily aligned with it. They might be nice things to have, but in a context where things are uncertain or you're having to dip into deficit spending to pull from the reserves, that can be one way of measuring what to continue and what to trim. So identifying, making sure the goals are ones that everyone's still good with. And then what are the metrics that you might use to look at the data, as Valerie said? And so I would really encourage that. Kelsey and Patrick, do you have anything else that you'd like to add about getting started?
I would just say that this is generally an approach that is very that communities are really receptive to, that district leaders feel is important, and board members. And so I think there is a lot of focus now on just making sure that the dollars that we spend are really effective in improving student outcomes, and that there's transparency around budget decision making. And so I think as a starting point, even having conversations with fellow board members about why you feel this is important in terms of an approach, and then the ways in which, and I mean, to get started, simply inventorying in those high priority areas, just the number of programs and interventions that you have in one area, I think can be really illuminating. And understanding, which ones of these are really high priority in the district.
Yeah, and not much else to add other than I think that it was really powerful to hear about getting on the same page in terms of which outcomes are we even focusing on. I think that, like you said, Mary, rolling it back to basics, I think that's a really powerful consensus to reach, and it's a good starting point for monitoring and then measuring ROI and focusing on student outcomes. But that first piece is really important, is being clear on what to focus on in the first place.
Right. Well, I appreciate everyone's insight. I think we've answered all of the other questions that our audience had, and I think we've touched on the core goals of this webinar today. And so I appreciate all of you, Trustee Davis, bringing that board member perspective, and Kelsey and Patrick from WestEd, building out both the context for this time of uncertainty and different factors that LEAs are facing, as well as some really kind of high-level overview of what that prioritization process entails. For additional information, I have 3 different contacts here for you. My information is here. If you have questions for Trustee Davis, please go ahead and email me and I will forward them to Trustee Davis. And then Dr. Krausen and Patrick have their email and information on this slide as well. As a reminder, we will be sending out this slide deck as well as a link to the recording, which gets posted on CSBA's YouTube channel. So if this is something that you want to review a portion just to kind of make sure that you didn't miss a point that someone was making, look for that email in the next day or two. But we appreciate you making the time today to join us and hope that this answered many of your questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.